There is a moment when fear arrives before thought. The part of you that takes comfort in believing the world is ordered, predictable and under control. That part goes very quiet, and something feels wrong. Often there is no explicit danger you can name, or immediate threat that you can see. Just a sudden certainty that you should not be here. The ancient Greeks had a name for this experience. They called it panic. And they traced it to a god. Not a god of temples or cities, nor of law, reason or justice, but something far older. And it is here that we encounter the ancient Greek god Pan. The image of horns, half human, half goat-like creature, playing a musical pipe, is familiar to many. But what is Pan actually the god of? And more importantly, what did people believe they gained by acknowledging him? And what, if anything, can he still teach us today? Because as we'll discover, the answer is not what most people think, and it comes with equal parts intrigue, reverence, and discomfort. To understand who and what Pan truly is, we first have to understand what he is not. Pan is not the devil. Yes, there are horns, the hooves, the association with wild sexuality, even elements of chaos and disorder. But this is a long-standing conditioning, born largely from the fact that medieval Christianity borrowed these features when constructing its image of Satan. That tells us far more about Christianity's need for a visual shorthand for evil than it does about Pan himself. The Greek god predates Christian demonology by over a millennium, and in his original context, he was never a figure of cosmic rebellion or moral corruption. He was rural, local and specific. In simple terms, a god of shepherds and mountains, not of hell. Pan is also not a fertility god, or certainly not in the crude sense that this label often implies. Yes, he is sexual. Yes, he is phallic. Yes, he is associated with procreation and the life force that drives animals and humans to reproduce. But fertility flattens him into a single function, when the ancient sources describe something far more complex and far more unsettling. He is also not a god who blesses crops, or one worshipped to ensure good fortune. He does not preside over weddings or harvest festivals, or indeed over any of the structures that organized society has created. Those are all the domain of the civilized world, and Pan exists at the edge of those things, in the unmanaged wild, in the places where human order has not yet taken hold, or where it has broken down. But importantly, this does not make Pan a god of chaos or evil, though he certainly provokes both. He is not opposed to civilization. He simply exists outside it. He is not immoral. He is a force that operates according to rhythms older than law and language, and older than the idea that the world should necessarily be orderly or make sense in the first place. Panic, the fear he inspires, has a name because the Greeks recognized it as a specific experience, sudden, potentially irrational, a loss of control that overtakes you in wild places when you are alone, or when the structures that usually hold you together stop working. We'll get to the modern interpretations in a moment, but panic is a symptom, not Pan's purpose. To understand what Pan actually is, we have to go back to his origins, and back to the god as he was first known. Pan comes from Arcadia, not the idealized pastoral fantasy that later poetry imagined, but the real place that was mountainous, remote and difficult, true wilderness. This was not soft countryside. It was a harsh terrain with high peaks and deep valleys, full of caves and rocky slopes, and it was isolated, often far from even the merest hint of ordered civilization, let alone larger cities. The people who worshipped Pan, they were not philosophers or priests. They were herders, shepherds who moved their flocks through the seasons following grass and water, people who spent long days alone in wild country, people who knew what it meant to be exposed and vulnerable and far from help. And it is they who most intimately knew Pan. He was not an Olympian in the familiar sense, not a great god dwelling in palaces or receiving grand sacrifices in marble temples. His shrines were caves and grottos and natural rock formations, places where the boundary between human space and wild space was already thin. The Homeric hymn to Pan describes him as a son of Hermes and a nymph, sometimes named Dryope, sometimes left unnamed. He was born with goat legs, horns and a beard. His mother, the nymph, fled in terror when she saw him. But Hermes took the child to Olympus, wrapped in a hareskin, and the gods delighted in him. This is telling because we see that Pan may belong to the gods, but he does not quite belong with them. He is welcomed, accepted and enjoyed, yet still very much other, an outsider, even among immortals. So where then do we actually find Pan? In ancient Greece, he is said to roam the mountains and the glens. Here he hunts, he plays music, he dances with nymphs. Another key part of Pan's story is that he sleeps in the heat of the afternoon when the land itself falls quiet. To intrude on that stillness was dangerous. Not because Pan punished in a moral sense, but because his sudden awakening was believed to disturb the very natural order of things, calm giving way to alarm, an order born from stillness that slips into disarray. It is from here fear then spreads sharply, not as confusion, but as the realization that Pan himself has been awakened, like coming across a wild animal that was not expecting you, startled and angered because you have entered its domain. And this was panic. And the metaphor that gives it this very specific type of fear is this. Before Pan was ever seen by those who intruded into his domain, he was sensed, maybe heard as a rustle or ominous music floating through the valley, but not seen, a notable presence, but without visible form. And so, you do not summon Pan, you encounter him. And the encounter is always on his terms and not yours. He exists at borders, between wilderness and pasture, between sound and silence, between ordered human activity and animal instinct. So shepherds honoured him because they lived in his territory. They left offerings at cave shrines. They invoked him for protection. Not because Pan was benevolent, but because it was better to acknowledge him than to ignore him. Pan was not a god representing civilization's expansion into the wild, but rather of the places where civilization stopped, where it could not reach, but most importantly, where civilization, and all that it entails, does not even apply. And in those places, Pan was not optional. He was simply there, a presence felt more than understood, known through experience and not doctrine. Ancient sources never describe Pan in psychological terms. They speak instead of experiences, sudden fear, loss of control, and an overwhelming presence. When later scholars tried to make sense of this, they didn't treat Pan as a moral figure or a chaotic one, but as something far older. They tied him directly to instinct, to the body, and to the moments where human order fails. And read this way, Pan is not a symbol imposed on the past. He is a way the ancient world explained something it recognized as real, and that reality is still relevant today. In the context of his name and his ancient birth, and the later understanding of panic, this fear is not something specific. It is not the rational response to a visible threat. Rather, it is the sudden, overwhelming collapse of rational control itself. Imagine this. You're walking, be it through an unfamiliar forest as the light fades, or on a dark, quiet city street after midnight. You are alone, and you are far from the known safety and normality of comfort. Nothing obvious changes on the outside, but suddenly the internal landscape shifts. There is a feeling and a sense that something is not right. Something within you is overpowered and it gives way. Your response to the environment may change, and maybe your actions too. Do you pause? Do you change direction? Do you walk faster with a heightened heartbeat and a sudden sweat? Do you even turn and run, even though nothing obvious in the external world has changed? This is not because you have seen danger explicitly, but because your ability to assess danger has failed. The mind that distinguishes between real and imagined stops functioning. Animals flee predators that are not there. Soldiers abandon battle for no reason that anyone can later explain. Travelers lose themselves in a country that they know well, seized by the certainty, the panic, that they will not survive. This is Pan's territory. Born from the wilderness, but it is not just the wilderness itself. It is the moment the self can no longer navigate its environment. The point where instinct overrides everything else, including logical thought. When you become briefly what you were before civilization taught you to be anything else. And you cannot negotiate with this primal force. You cannot reason your way out, because reason is precisely what has stopped functioning. Pan does not cause this. Like many older gods, he is this. He is the force itself, the rupture in comfortable, normal reality, the return of something older than the thinking mind. So here is what Pan represents. Not chaos, not evil, not even wilderness in the abstract sense. Pan is instinct, and he is appetite and desire. The parts of the self that do not require permission or justification, that do not ask whether something is appropriate or wise, and it is maybe born out of unfiltered intuition, maybe out of something deeper and more primal still. But he represents the parts of the self that simply act. He is the body's knowledge, impulses that arrive before thought, the sudden surge of fear, lust, hunger, rage, states that bypass deliberation entirely and take control immediately. As we have said, this is pre-moral, not immoral. Pan does not transgress because he does not recognize boundaries in the first place. He exists prior to the systems that create those boundaries, prior to the idea that the self should be managed and regulated or brought into alignment with social expectation. He is what you are when no one is watching. He is what you are when the structures that usually shape your behavior, for whatever reason, stop applying. And that is why he is dangerous. Not because he corrupts, but because he reveals. He shows what is already there, lying underneath. He shows the parts of you that do not care about virtue, reputation, or consequence. He shows the parts that want, that move freely, that refuse to be still, held, or confined. What we might call a wild self. And once you have felt it, you know. You know that the ordered self, the one that believes it is in control, that makes plans, that thinks it understands the world, is actually not as stable as it pretends to be. Beneath it, always, is the wild twin that Pan represents, waiting. Therefore, Pan is not actually confined to mountains or forests. He doesn't disappear when you return to civilization with its order and expectations. He is the part of you that those wild places reveal, and the part that lies dormant often, but is never fully gone. We cannot talk Pan, of course, without mentioning the instrument that he plays as a vital piece of his story. Her name was Syrinx, a nymph, a follower of Artemis devoted to the hunt, to chastity, and to wild places where men did not intrude. Pan desired her. She fled, and he pursued. And when she reached the river Ladon, with nowhere left to run, she called to the river god for help. He transformed her, not into safety, but into reeds growing at the water's edge. Pan arrived, and he found what he desired, but only as reeds. And when the wind blew through these reeds, they made a sound. And so he cut them, and he bound them together with wax, and made the syrinx, the pan flute, so that he could keep her with him, so that she would always sing when he breathed into her. This is not a love story. It is a wild possession story. Desire that does not stop when refused, and desire that reshapes the object of its pursuit into something that can no longer refuse. But it is also something else. The syrinx is breath made audible, air passing through absence. The sound comes not from the reed, but from the hollow space inside it, from what is no longer there. And that is why Pan's music is unsettling. It is not a performance. It is not art in the cultivated sense. It is intrusion, a sound that should not be in the landscape but is, a melody with no visible source. You hear it before you see him. That is how the story goes. The pipes echo through valleys, across hillsides, in forests where no one else is present. It is haunting, unsettling, and you cannot tell where it is coming from. Because sound in wilderness behaves differently than sound in human spaces. It bounces, it distorts, it seems to arrive from multiple directions at once, or from no direction at all. And this is disorientating. And disorientation is the beginning of panic. If you cannot locate the source of a sound, you cannot assess whether it is dangerous, you cannot decide whether to flee or stand still. The rational mind tries to solve the problem, and it cannot. Pan's sounds bypass conscious decision and triggers response, and so instinct takes over. The flute is his presence made audible, a signal that the wild self is near, and that the boundary that usually contains and holds has now thinned to the point of breaking. And so the story goes. Once you hear it, it is already too late to prepare. Pan has awoken, and he is near. Pan made sense in Arcadia, in the mountains, and in the lives of the people who spent their days in wild country. People who understood that civilization was not the only power that existed. But as Greek culture urbanized, Pan became a problem. Not because he changed, but because the world around him did. Cities operate on different principles than the mountains. They require organization and shared rules, often the suppression of individual impulse in favor of collective order. They demand that the wild self be managed, made predictable, legible, even contained. Pan represents everything that this civilized order cannot tolerate. The refusal to be governed by rational structures. He could still be acknowledged, honoured even, from a distance, as a rustic god of shepherds and country folk, a novelty who was charming in his wildness perhaps, but not something you brought into the centre of civic life. And so, as a moral philosophy developed, particularly with the rise of Stoicism and later Platonic thought, Pan became increasingly difficult to justify. Those systems prized reason, self-discipline, and the mastery of appetite and primal instinct. They taught that the good life required subordination of passion to intellect, and that virtue lay in self-control. Pan offered none of that. He could not be subordinated. He could not be reasoned with. He simply was, and his presence became a problem. As it has done many times, Christianity completed what philosophy had begun. The horns, the hooves, the sexuality, the association with wild places and uncontrolled states, all of it mapped a little too easily onto the image of the devil, the enemy of order, the tempter, the embodiment of everything that must be resisted. This was not, in this case, necessarily a deliberate conspiracy. It was convenience. Pan's appearance provided a ready-made visual language for evil. His attributes of instinct, desire, the rejection of moral law, aligned perfectly with what Christianity needed its devil to represent. But while Pan became distorted, pushed to the edges of acceptable thought, his repression displaced him rather than destroying him, and so he did not disappear. So as hard as ordered society and civilization and religion tried, they could not erase Pan and his ways. They could only teach you to ignore his ways and to suppress them, to pretend they were not there. The wild self, however, the primal twin, does not vanish when you refuse to acknowledge it. It may lay dormant and quietened like a caged animal, but at some point it returns. In one form or another, it breaks through. Repressed instinct does not dissolve. It accumulates and intensifies. And when it finally resurfaces, and it will, it often does in forms far more destructive than the original impulse would have ever been. Anxiety, compulsion, rage, obsession, breakdowns that seem to come from nowhere, but which have been building for years beneath a surface of control and repression. We see this in the extremes people reach when instinct finally overwhelms the structures built to contain it. And yet, much like the herders of old, as long as we acknowledge and pay homage to Pan, the wild self, there is a space for him to exist in healthier ways. He appears in unfiltered creativity, in moments of consensual passion that take control of the body. When a gut feeling, when instinct is followed, bypassing or even defying logical thought. When social conditioning and rigid order are challenged, creating necessary societal change as barriers break and comfortable molds begin to reform, and so much more. And the larger question is this: is this loss of control and this breaking down of barriers and order to carve new paths forward actually a bad thing? Is Pan part of an answer and part of evolution? What if the controlled self could walk hand in hand with its wild twin, both acknowledged, both valued, neither dominating nor subservient to the other, but working in balance? And that's an interesting thought. As with so many older icons and ancient gods, Pan still matters because the thing he represents has not gone away. We live in a world built on the premise that the self can be managed and optimized, that absolute control is the ultimate goal. A world that for some time now has believed the wild twin is something to be hidden away, or something to be forced into alignment with systems of order and productivity, or suppressed so that our actions and behaviors become based upon what is deemed acceptable by society or by greater powers. Is this picture an outright lie, or is it simply incomplete? A kind of mass amnesia that ignores a crucial part of our humanity. Because alongside the managed self is the wild self, the part that wants without asking permission, that feels without justification, and that acts from instinct before thought catches up. And this is a large part of Pan's territory now. Not just mountains, not just forests, but the interior wilderness, the parts of yourself you have tried to domesticate, and perhaps believed you have succeeded in doing so. But Pan reminds us that domestication is not the answer, because eventually the wild self demands attention. If honoured and acknowledged, this expression can be reasoned with. But as we have seen, when suppressed for too long, the wild self returns with vengeance. It is this imbalance in the opposite direction, where the controlled self falls by the wayside as the wild self takes full control, that we will explore next. Because Pan is not the only god who operates here. Bacchus and Dionysus, represent the wild self unrestrained, ecstatic and collective. The loss of boundaries in ritual frenzy and shared intoxication, the dissolution of the individual into something larger. And then there is Loki, from another tradition entirely, who represents chaos not as madness, but as structural necessity, a force that disrupts in order to reveal what the system has hidden. Trickster as truth-teller, destruction as renewal. These are different faces of the same problem, the problem of what to do with the parts of existence that refuse to be ordered and that will not stay where you put them. So Pan is not a god one worships lightly, but a force that requires acknowledgement. He does not offer a solution, he never did, or rather not a solution in the way a civilized, ordered mind might expect. He is what remains when control fails and reason collapses, when the self, constructed from order alone, proves insufficient to hold you together. And here's a reminder that control is provisional, that the self is not as unified or as stable as it pretends to be, because the wild, whether outside or inside, does not ask for your consent before arriving. So what is Pan the god of? He is the god of what you cannot manage, and of what you cannot ignore, of what returns again and again, no matter how many times you try to bury it. The instinct, the rupture, the sound in the wilderness that should not be there, but is.